Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm delighted to be speaking with sports psychologist Gareth Mole. Gareth, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan.
It's great to have you here. Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Sure, Dan. So my name is Gareth Mole. A little fun fact, I was named after Gareth Edwards, obviously the legendary Welsh rugby union player, one of the greats. And I suppose sometimes I do reflect, if you name a child after one of the greatest athletes, maybe he or she is determined to potentially end up working in the sports industry. So I was born in South Africa, lived in South Africa until I was 10, and I suppose growing up in South Africa really shaped my passion for sport, and you could probably guess the kinds of sports which I'm particularly fond of and particularly passionate about. So obviously cricket, rugby union. So my childhood sporting heroes are people like Jonty Rhodes, Jules van der Westhuizen. I think I was living in South Africa when Gary Player passed on the baton to Ernie Els. So I definitely give credit to South Africa for my love of sport. And I suppose, and we may talk about this later, growing up in apartheid, there's a part of me that feels like my sort of sense of wanting things to be fair might be from those days. When I was 10, moved to the UK. I went to boarding school in the UK at a place called Oundle in Northamptonshire near Peterborough. And worth mentioning that because I have been appropriately accused of being fairly opinionated, and I put that down to a lot of debating whilst at Oundle. At Oundle, certainly when I was there, debating was sort of regarded as a sport, and so we did a lot of it, and we got fairly good at it. And once you have sort of have gotten into the routine of giving your opinions on an almost daily basis, it is quite hard to turn it off. And then I did my undergraduate psychology at the University of Leeds, which was fantastic. And then after a little bit of backpacking and so on, I moved to Australia in 2003 to complete my master's in sports psychology, which turned out to be, I should say, the last running of that particular master's program. So I sort of got fairly lucky in that I applied from the UK, got accepted, moved over here, and then shortly after moving over here, found out that they weren't going to be taking any new sports psych master students on because the program was wrapping up. And then sort of, I suppose like a lot of us, Dan, I sort of graduated. I'm now a qualified sports psychologist, so I was waiting for the phone to start ringing, because I'd spent 7 years studying, and it was tumbleweed. And so I sort of thought to myself, hang on, I've just relocated to the other side of the world. I've spent 7 years studying, and there's a sort of a dearth of jobs. What do I do about it? And so I just decided that the only sort of proactive option was to create work for myself. So in 2005, I started Condor Performance. And so we've sort of slowly grown in the last 15 years. And, without having this as a goal or an intention, someone who's incredibly process focused, I've ended up with a team of 9 other psychologists. We call them sport psychologists and performance psychologists because, as some of your listeners may be aware, in Australia you cannot use the term sports psychologist if you don't have the endorsement in sport and exercise psychology. So myself and Michelle Payne, who's a bit of a pioneer in sports psych here in Australia, are able to and choose to use the term sports psychologists, and the other 8 are all performance psychologists, which here in Australia means they're all registered psychologists with AHPRA, the Australian Health Practitioners Regulatory Authority. So basically we are a team of sports psychologists and performance psychologists that works predominantly in sport, but also in non-sporting settings. such as the performing arts and so on. And then just to wrap up the intro, to give you and the listeners an idea of my sort of day-to-day work. So I suppose I spend the majority of my time on the business and not in the business. So the kind of things I would do on a Thursday morning be supervising the other psychologists, sales and marketing, which I've always been surprised is regarded as a bit of a dirty word for highly qualified people, whereas I see it as absolutely essential. Risk management, bookkeeping, etc. I only work with a small percentage of our overall clients, and quite interestingly, a growing percentage of those are sporting coaches. About a third of my personal clients are now sporting coaches. So I have no interaction with their players. In fact, I think their players wouldn't even know I existed. I work exclusively with the coach in order to help him or her become a better mental skills coach, a better mental coach, as well as just coaching people and not just players, if that makes sense. And just finally, as a sports psychologist, I would describe myself as very behavioral. So I know you've had guests on who are big fans of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. I draw heavily on that. I suppose a good way to describe my personal philosophy as an applied sports psychologist is, really I try and almost direct everything back to the action side of things, the behavioral side of things. So I like CBT, but I will very much lean towards the B of CBT. If I'm to describe how I'm operating, it would be a tiny little C and a huge B. That's kind of how I would describe myself. So, for example, when helping golfers to develop pre-shot routines, it's the routines of the golfers that I work with are very, very action-based, and I'm almost intentionally trying to minimize the cognitive demands that are included in that in those pre-shot routines.
Interesting. A thorough introduction there, Gareth. I love it. Now, we've spoken off-air about what we can talk about, and you threw me a bit of a curveball, which was this idea of perhaps talking about what psychology might look like in 2050, which I thought was a really fun topic to talk about. And but I think we can have a broad conversation, because I think there's several things you've said already which are really interesting, and we can bring in the behavioural stuff into that, and you've talked about marketing and selling and what we do as a profession, helping people understand. And I think that all of that really comes under the header of psychology in 2050. So it's going to be an interesting conversation. I mean, if I may ask you, when we were talking off air, you mentioned, let's talk about what psychology can look like in 2050. What drew you to that? Why that conversation?
Two things happened a couple of weeks ago. So one is I listened to most of your interviews, and I'm a bit of a fanboy in that basically I almost insist that all of my colleagues listen to most of the conversations that you've had. And one of the things that I picked up on is that you often ask your guests if you had a time machine and you went back 5 or 10 years. And I thought to myself, if Dan's got this time machine, then I think we might want to do a couple of trips in the other direction. And so that was the first thing. And then what happened, almost as if it was telling me to respond, is that Back to the Future 2 was on Australian television. And of course, in the movie, for anyone who hasn't watched it, the film is set in, I think, 1985, and Back to the Future Part 2 is 30 years into the future. And I thought it would be a really fun little conversation for us to have about not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, which in many ways sort of seems so close, but what about 30 years, which I'm guessing is probably around about the time where the two of us will be sort of either about to retire or retired, but hopefully still alive. So that's why I picked 2050 for us to sort of, I suppose, in many ways just hypothesize about some of the directions that the profession might be heading. And I suppose just the final bit, there is a part of me that can't help but think from a goal-setting perspective, if you can crystallize what the future might look like, maybe what we're able to do for appealing to the greater sports psych community is maybe we can work together to actually increase the chances that some of them happen.
Well, let's get in our DeLorean, our car, our Back to the Future car, head to 2050. I'm sure there's many people who would think of better things to do if they did have a car to go to 2050, but hey, we're passionate sports psychologists, so we're going to go and seek what sports psychology looks like in 2050. So talk to me. Give me your number one prediction or thought or feeling.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify that I'm calling these they're not really hypotheses, I'm calling them hypotheses. Hypotheses is kind of a bit like a hypothesis, but with slightly less evidence to make the educated guess on. So the first two, Dan, are linked, and I'm super keen to get your thoughts on these. The first one is an official change of name to performance psychology as the overarching name of the discipline in 2050. And funny enough, just to really sort of emphasize my point, last week I listened to your conversation with Paula Reed, the adventure psychologist, and it was really obvious to me that someone like Paula and her passion would fit very nicely under performance psychology semantically, but that she was articulating very well that it's not really the same as sports psychology. There was a fantastic conversation between the two of you how in many ways she thought sport was a lot more predictable and so on. So my first prediction is the overarching name of the discipline will be performance psychology, and we'll have the option of calling ourselves performance psychologists. And part two will be specialization within performance psychology. So what we're basically saying is that someone could be a golf psychologist as a sub-discipline of performance psychology, or they could be an adventure psychologist like Paula mentioned, or maybe they aren't that interested in sport, but they love the performing arts, and so maybe they would be a dance psychologist. And all these different performance pursuits would fit semantically, logically under the broad term performance psychology. And for those who might be listening who think, oh no, because that's moving away from specialization, we can then specialize within performance psychology.
So just to try and draw a picture here, at the top of our sheet of paper we've got performance psychologist.
Yes.
And down from that, I'm picturing sports psychologist, maybe performing arts psychologist, maybe
yes.
I can't really use the term, well, maybe business psychologist, although that has its own sort of credentials.
Yes.
But underneath sports psychologist would be all the sports that you can think of. And what you're saying is you've got to work in, say, 4 or 5 or 6 that could actually render you a sports psychologist. Would that be a picture I've created that would be accurate to your vision?
A very accurate picture, Dan. Yeah, so I suppose there's a couple of obvious ones missing. I think military,
yep.
I think
okay.
would be
Thank
one,
yep.
which would be another type of performance psychology. I don't know the name of it, but we work with a lot of people in the medical profession, people like ambulance drivers and surgeons, often in their training. So we're basically using the same kind of principles that we would use to help a golfer or a cricketer perform under pressure. We would use those exact same, or very similar, I should say, mental strategies to help someone become, better at performing a complicated surgical procedure. So I suppose you could call it medical psychology, maybe something along those lines. That debate could. Yeah, healthcare psychology, exactly, very sort of poignant at the moment. And all of these would be the layer under performance psychology, where you've got practitioners who are both good at the, you call it the below the line, above the line. I suppose I call it the mental health and the mental toughness side of things, or the mental side of the actual performance area, and then the mental aspects of the rest of their life.
I think it's interesting because I think if we draw it back to today, listening to you speak, it makes me consider the confusion that people have around sports psychology. What is sports psychology? Is it about performance? Is it about welfare and well-being? There's a big drive around mental health at the moment, and I've spoken quite a bit about this on the Sports Psych show with various people, that conflation between welfare, well-being and mental health. What is it that we do? How do we describe it? What qualifications do we need? What registrations do we need? It almost feels like what you want in 2050 is a much more streamlined picture, some clarity here, whereby everything falls under this term of performance psychology.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. I think I think a label is a really important aspect of clarity. Picking the right label.
Yeah.
And for me, semantically, performance psychology is the best label. I mean, I'm sure it's the case there in the UK, but here in Australia, I can think of a couple of very prominent qualified sports psychologists who refer to themselves as sports psychologists who don't do much work in sport. And in fact, the official title, the full title here in Australia at the moment, is sport and exercise psychologist. And having done this work for 15 years, I can tell you I don't give any advice to anyone on the exercise side of things. So I think that there has to be a realization that at some point, if we want to collectively inform the public about what we do, we might want to start by picking the label that is most closely related to what we all actually do.
Interesting. So performance psychology at the top. Underneath that, strands including sports psychology, exercise psychology, military psychology, public sector psychology, private sector psychology such as corporate psychology. Interesting. And building on that idea, around the sports psychology piece, this idea of working in multiple sports, or specialising in a sport. I mean, is that something that you come across? Do you think a challenge is for a sports psychologist to work across multiple sports? Do you think sports psychologists should specialise? Do you think 2050 you will see a lot more, well, I'm a performance psychologist and I specialise in golf. I'm a performance psychologist and I specialise in soccer. I'm a performance psychologist and I specialise in baseball. Do you think specialism is the future?
I think that's where we will end up. I think it's inevitable. I mean, if you look at other professions, things like the medical profession, for example, that's basically what's happened. You got people who work in the medical profession now who you got knee surgeons who only operate on a particular type of knee injury. Like that's all they do. Whereas 20 years ago or 30 years ago, all knee surgeons had to be able to do everything. I do like your question though, Dan, because you're almost implying, I think, that is that too much? In other words, are our skill sets actually better off if you have to work in rugby and then golf, and you have to then sort of be flexible. I think that ultimately what we would probably want to see is the psychologist having the choice. I think that's what we would probably want to see. You know, it might be that, you know, I have a colleague, for example, who absolutely loves baseball. And as soon as a baseballer contacts us, you know, it goes straight to my colleague David, and that it might be reasonable to say to someone like him, look, do you just want to fill your boots with baseballers because you love the sport so much? Whereas for someone else, that might lead to monotony. It might lead to boredom. Who are we to say? You know, individual differences is a common theme that keeps coming up in the show, which I think is such an important reminder. I think it would be about creating a mechanism that would allow the psychologists to choose. I would definitely not choose to specialize in one sport. I would probably pick the ones that I'm most, you know, fond of, sports like squash, cricket, rugby union, golf, football, etc. So I would probably naturally end up with about 5 or 6, and therefore it's likely I would then continue to use the term sports psychologist who works or specializes across those sports.
I think it's an interesting landscape. I think obviously right now, when you qualify as a sports psychologist, you qualify to work in all sports. And I think the vast majority of sports psychs would say, well, that's what I do. I'm a sports psychologist. I work across all sports. I think that I had a conversation with Professor Brendan Cropley on episode 90 about this. And I think it's one of those, like every landscape, it has its advantages and disadvantages, its strengths and its weaknesses. You know, as a former professional golfer, I feel fairly confident walking into a golfing environment and having a great deal of knowledge that's going to set the scene, that's going to help me to build the relationship with the golfer. You know, I've been there. I've been in his or her shoes. I know what it feels like. So I feel I'm at an advantage there. At the same time, and not that I've actually ever come across a golfer who said this, at the same time I can also fully appreciate that that golfer has a lot of people around them who know about golf. You know, he will have one, maybe a couple of coaches, maybe a couple of, you know, a putting coach, a short game coach, as well as a full swing coach. He or she has got a lot of people around them who know a lot about golf, who can advise on that side of things. And sometimes I think that, you know, sports people like to have people around them who don't necessarily have an expertise of their particular sport and knowledge of their sport, who they can talk with more generally about performance psychology or welfare and well-being. So I think there's that interesting landscape there. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I think it's I think it brings its own advantages and its own limitations when one specialises. But when you were speaking there, I was thinking of multidisciplinary. I was thinking of a psych who says, you know, who comes in and says, that's my strength here, is I work across multiple sports. And actually, because of that, I bring in a range of experiences to the table. And I think of I'll get your comment here in a second. I think of the sports psychs who maybe spend 20-25 weeks out on the golf tour. And I'm sure there's some who do it on the tennis tour as well, which is great. But where they're missing out is they're missing out on working in other sports, and experiencing those other sports can fuel what they do in golf or in tennis or in any sport that they spend the most amount of time in.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was having a vote, the way I would do it is in training, in the journey to becoming a qualified performance psychologist. Let's say that in 2015 that's a regulated and registered profession. I would insist that the trainees have exposure right across that spectrum that you mentioned earlier. So, you know, you have to work with some people in the public sector, for example, because that's part of your criteria. But that once you have earned the right to call yourself a performance psychologist, then ultimately you can then decide. And I suppose one little comment, Dan, that, I forget which episode it was, but there was a great conversation between you and someone about how important it is to know the sport. And I think you kind of both agreed that it's better to have the knowledge and not need it than need it and not have it. Anyway, if those weren't the words you used, those were the words which I remembered from listening into that conversation. It's better to have the understanding of what leg before wicket is and not need it than be in an awkward conversation where they're talking about how leg before wicket is kind of his or her awkward way of getting out, and having to put your hand up and saying, sorry, can you guys just tell me what LBW stands for? So I don't think we are necessarily in a situation whereby just because someone knows a huge amount about bobsled, that means that they're going to blurt out a whole bunch of sort of technical and tactical advice on bobsled. You would hope that as part of the training, what they're saying is you are not the technical and the tactical coach, but a knowledge of this sport is going to allow you to build rapport and reduce the chances that people are going to be talking a language that you have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, and as you're speaking there, I'm actually thinking of the advantages of knowing quite a lot about a specific sport. For me, I think it can help you set up better questions. I think it can increase your range of ideas around performance psychology. I personally think I can have more ideas in golf psychology than more solutions than somebody who hasn't been in a golfing environment before, in my humble opinion. So I can see an advantage in that respect. Is it critical? Absolutely not. So I think that's an interesting landscape. I think, related to that, I mean, you started to talk about the qualifications a sports psychologist had. And I do wonder if there can be some professional governing bodies who could hand out certain credit or qualifications related to a specific sport, related to psychology. So in golf, maybe the Professional Golfers Association could have psychology courses for psychologists within golf, so that you can as a psychologist go on these courses and learn the specifics of golf psychology. Maybe the RFU in England could offer psychology courses related to rugby for psychologists to go on. And maybe coaches might go on them as well. I mean, I know the English FA have done this, or did do this for a number of years, 5 levels, but for psychologists to go on as well, to be able to really learn the language and the specific challenges that people face, because golf psychology is different to tennis psychology, is different to football psychology, is different to rugby psychology, and so on and so forth. Of course, they have similarities, but there are differences. So I wonder, getting your comment here, I wonder from a professional perspective, can we have accreditation that enables practitioners to advance their knowledge of specific sports?
I think that's an absolutely crackerjack idea. One of the reasons I love the format that you've created here with the Sports Psych shows, I didn't think of that when I was sort of brainstorming to myself earlier. That's not something that popped into my mind, but through the process of dialogue, that idea has just popped out. And it's only 2020. We've got 30 years where we can potentially make some of these things happen. And of course, one of the really important things there is you've got the football experts, or the rugby experts being involved. We're not excluding them and saying, hang on, guys, we don't need you. We can learn plenty about your sport, and we're the ones with the fancy psychology credentials. It's bringing them into the conversation and saying, look, you guys know a lot about football. We know a lot about human behavior. You teach us a bit, we'll teach you a bit, and then we'll come up with some kind of clear sort of set of qualifications and we'll then work together to inform the public, so they're not sort of having to second guess, what that person does and what that person does. And just a final comment on of course, on knowledge. We need to remember that knowledge falls along a continuum, and so we're not saying that everybody who wanted to work in golf as a psychologist would need your knowledge of golf. I think it's going to be very difficult to compete with someone who has played like you have and has coached like you have. So maybe if your knowledge of golf is a 10 out of 10 and someone who's never heard of the game or the sport is a 0 out of 10, and I've met a few of those, by the way, maybe what we're saying is that in order for you to work in golf as a psychologist, you need to prove a 7 out of 10 knowledge of golf. We're not saying that you need to become, an equivalent expert of someone who has played the sport, at a high level, coached it at a high level. It's simply saying, if you want to work in golf, we can't allow you to do that if your knowledge of golf is a 3 out of 10.
Your next prediction for 2050.
What were we calling them? Hypotheses, I think.
Hypotheses, thank you.
Yes, we may have just invented a new word, which is totally appropriate, I think, when you're thinking about the future. So my next one is the slightly controversial one. This is where we start. In 2050, I think there'll be much more emphasis on formal qualifications. And what I mean by that is I think that there will be a much reduced likelihood that someone will be allowed to work in any performance sector who hasn't met certain, I suppose formal qualifications. So I'm predicting, it's just a prediction, that there will be a lot less people involved in sport and performance who simply finished high school and then decided they were going to start a business and make up a title. That's my prediction.
Why do you think that's important?
Look, I suppose the reason why I wanted to include that, and this is maybe where the hope bit of the hypothesis is really emphasized, because I run a business which I suppose is, in many ways, I'm looking after the best interest of a total of 10 psychologists. I suppose I have a lot of conversations with sporting organizations and individuals as well. And one thing's very clear, and that is that in particular in sport, there is still a huge lack of understanding about what various professional titles actually mean from a kind of a risk point of view. And so one of the things that we're doing on a fairly regular basis is sort of trying to educate and make aware the fact that, for example, as psychologists, we all have professional indemnity insurance. That's a very boring sort of fact, but it's a fact nonetheless. And therefore, if you do decide to employ, let's say, a mind coach or a mindset coach, then I would like the sporting entity to know that they're doing that, and they can tolerate the risk that comes with that person having no professional insurance, for example, and other things besides. So I think that what will eventually happen is that we will invite into the conversation people who potentially don't have any recognized qualifications, but who do a very good job of the work. People like Gilbert Anoka is incredibly well regarded and has done an amazing job in New Zealand rugby, but is not a registered psychologist. So bringing people like Gilbert into the conversation and saying, okay, how do we communicate all these different titles, to the sporting community out there, I think is a really important step, and it may involve the difficult decision of certain people who don't have recognized qualifications who might not be doing a good job. It may involve us saying to them, you can no longer work with such and such a team or such and such an individual. Dan, what's your thoughts on this? How how's things panning out in the UK with regards to that? Is that the hypothesis with the longest bow?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start by saying I think clarity, again, I'm going to come back to this word clarity. I just think the sports industry needs greater clarity as to what... Let's come back to your title of performance psychology. What do performance psychologists, or we could use sports psychologists, what do sports psychologists do? Let's come back to 2020 and call it sports psychology, and just say, look, what do sports psychologists do? What are your qualifications? Who are you registered with? What do you do? And how are we protected? What are we getting when we get a sports psychologist? And I think we as an industry need to be better. So if we're talking about 2020 to 2050, 30 years, I think we've got 30 years to become better at helping the sports industry gain clarity as to what sports psychology is and what sports psychologists do. I personally don't have a problem with anybody going away and doing whatever they want in terms of they can do a 2-week course, they can do a 2-day course, they can do a 2-year course, whatever they want to do, they do. But I think what national governing bodies, organisations, clubs, teams require is clarity. I think we need to be, there needs to be as much exposure as possible with regard sports psychology and sports psychologists, so that these national governing bodies, clubs, teams, organisations know exactly what they get. And if they choose to say, okay, we know you've got the qualifications, you've got the registration, you've got the insurances, we know our people are safe, however, we're going to go with Johnny or Mary over there who's got their 2-week NLP qualification because, you know what, we think they're brilliant at what they do. Fine, no problem at all. But I think we, in the next 30 years, if we want to talk about this span of time, we have to be better at every single national governing body, every single organisation, every single club, globally, in every single sport, knowing exactly what they get with us. Now, that is complex and complicated because every single country has different rules. You know, in England, in the UK, I should say, there's an interesting dynamic whereby practitioner psychologist, the term practitioner psychologist, is legally protected, but the term performance psychologist isn't. So again, I could do a 2-week course and then call myself a performance psychologist. So there's an interesting dynamic there. So I think we do have to try to come together. That's a very bland statement, I know, but some people within psychology who are registered psychologists within their country have to come together and find a way to help our global sports organisations understand what they get when they employ us as psychologists. When we do that, I think then there's very real choice through that very real clarity.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. There's probably just a couple of additions there. I think that one is what I really like about what you said there is we're ensuring that the consumer is the one that knows what we do. So I think it was in episode 2 with Chris Shambrook where I think he was alluding to this fact, if memory serves me correctly, but he said something along the lines of we know a lot about what we do, like you and me, because we work within the profession. But what about, Bill, the rugby coach from down the road? Like, does he know? A few months ago, I went to stay with some friends in Sydney, and they were like, "Oh, one of your sports psychologist guys is all over the news at the moment." And I was like, "Oh, show me the article." And sure enough, it was not somebody who was a qualified psychologist. It was a mindset coach. And so these friends of mine, just naturally assumed that because that person was working in the mental side of sport, that they were a sports psychologist. So I think that is an absolute key to it. We have to start including various different programs, which means that the consumer, the people who are potentially interested in our services, they're the ones that know what it means to be a qualified performance psychologist and what it means to not be a qualified performance psychologist. That's the real key with regards to that third prediction of more emphasis on formal qualifications.
Well, I think you've eloquently put it in that sentence. The consumer needs to know what we do. I think that's a really eloquent way of putting it. The challenge is it's on a global scale. The challenge is that we could go down to the layperson, the person who's just a sports fan, and most people don't have a clue, no idea. And if they're going to make an assumption, they're going to assume it's predominantly around mental health. I think there are a lot of coaches, through no fault of their own, who would see it in a similar vein, mental health towards welfare and well-being. And then I think there's the more informed coaches, players, key stakeholders in our organisations, sporting organisations, who understand that there's a performance psychology piece to this as well. And actually, ironically, I think most sports psychologists see themselves as purveyors of performance psychology. So there really needs to be an education process. We need to become a proper profession. And we are we are a proper profession. I mean, there are papers, research articles out there, commentaries that say, well, we're not a profession because we don't have a standard practice. Strength and by and large, and I might get vilified for this on social media, but my understanding of, say, sports science or especially strength and conditioning is that there are standard methodologies of practice that run through those industries, and therefore it becomes much easier for them to be recognized professions. But anyway, I think what we need to do is we need to avoid the rant, because I think it is getting better. But I think, as we're talking about 30 years, 2050, I think we need to be less scared of marketing. Coming back to your marketing point at the beginning, we need to be less scared of marketing, of sales. We need to be less scared of helping people understand what it is that we do on those multiple levels: performance psychology, welfare and well-being, and mental health. Let's move along. Give me another hypothesis.
Yes, number 4. Yes, so number 4 was much greater collaboration between coaches and performance psychologists. And I hope everyone's sitting down for this. The kicker to this is, in 30 years' time, this collaboration between coaches and performance psychologists will eventuate in the first few head coaches who are qualified performance psychologists. In other words, people who potentially have no experience playing a particular sport will be given the top job. So obviously in English football, we're talking about the manager here. In most other sports, we're talking about the head coach. And I suppose for me, this is, again, referring back to a lot of the conversations that you've had with your guests, a lot of the really interesting conversations were from coaches who were, basically saying, look, what we do as a coach is psychology. And I've heard you say many, many times, you just can't remove the psychology from the equation. Depending on when you put this episode out, obviously you and I both know that Liverpool have just won their first Premier League title for 30 years, and if you listen to Jurgen Klopp, it would be easy to assume the guy had some pretty impressive psychology qualifications. So I think that the fourth hypothesis is going to be much more collaboration between coaches and performance psychologists. So an expansion of what I do at the moment with a third of my clients who are sporting coaches, but that becoming much more common place. And then the eventual end point of that will be, if I'm working with a coach and assisting him or her so much with all aspects of their coaching, because ultimately you cannot remove the psychosocial part of human improvement. You just can't. You may not think it's there, but it's there. Then what will eventually happen is that some people will be then said, well, why don't you just come in and be the head coach? And if that happens, if that prediction happens, then obviously one thing that we really want to make happen is for those first few qualified psychologists to do the best possible job. I refer back to Annika Sorensen, who I think in 2003 was invited to play on one of the men's tour events. Golf. And under obscene pressure. A female golfer invited to play on on one of the men's tour events, but she didn't do that well. I did a bit of research before. She came 96th out of 111. So what we would want to ensure, if my prediction is correct, Dan, and that in 30 years' time you will see qualified performance psychologists in the role of head coach or manager, what we've got to make sure happens is those first few do an excellent job, both from a results point of view, from an impact point of view, because otherwise it could set us back another 20 years. If the first few that are given that opportunity don't do a great job, then as you can imagine, the sports industry might misjudge us unfairly. And so we would have to work very hard to making sure that those first few who were given the opportunity did the best possible job possible. And we see it already. There's head coaches who come from biomechanics. There's head coaches who come from strength and conditioning. Isn't it a bit bizarre that on paper the area which is most aligned with coaching, which is surely human improvement, psychology, is the one that's least likely to generate a head coach? From my point of view, it's the most likely. And I think all we've got at the moment in 2020 is a situation where, to be honest, and this refers back to some of your comments earlier, I don't think the sports industry is ready for that. I don't think that if there was a qualified sport or performance psychologist who was actually the head coach of a Premier League team, of a Major League Baseball team, I think the first thing they'd do is say, don't use the term sports psychologist or performance psychologist. People are going to get the wrong idea. And I think that's very indicative.
I think it's interesting, as you're speaking there, I'm thinking of the question, how much domain-specific expertise do you need to have as a coach? So if I was to join the coaching team, if I was to join Jose Mourinho's coaching team, if I was to join Jurgen Klopp's coaching team, how much domain-specific knowledge do I need for that to happen? And I think it's intriguing. I really do. That kind of thing has happened already in British soccer. So Steve McLaren invited Bill Beswick to be his assistant manager at Middlesbrough actually a couple of decades ago. I know that Bruno De Michelis, an Italian sports psychologist, was brought over by Carlo Ancelotti around 2008-2009 to be his assistant manager at Chelsea, after being his assistant manager at AC Milan, or at least being very influential at AC Milan. So that kind of thing has happened, but it's very, very rare. I'm sure there are other instances in other sports globally, and maybe listeners can tweet in if they know of that happening. But I think it's very possible, and I would like to see it, because I think that can be such a crucial role that somebody can play. I think you can coach, because you don't necessarily need much domain-specific knowledge to be a coach, especially if what would normally happen is you'd have a couple of other coaches who have a vast amount of domain-specific knowledge. They have a vast amount of knowledge on the strategical, tactical, physical, technical side of the specific sport you're talking about. I think you could still coach. I certainly think that coach could take on the role of a head of psychosocial methodology within that coaching unit, which I think is sorely lacking. And again, in my mind, when I'm thinking of this, I'm always thinking of, say, Premier League soccer in England, because I know that the coaching teams there are quite big, but you could say it about baseball, the American version of football, NFL, basketball. There are fairly substantial coaching staff. The size of the coaching staff is quite big. I think it always lacks what I would describe as a head of psychosocial methodology. So I think that person could do that. And just, let's come back to on-pitch involvement. Let's come back to your notion of this is about working towards 2050. If on the pitch or on the court or on the field is where it happens, why would you not have the psych there, in amongst it, doing it? I just don't get that. Unless the psych is a clinical psych and it's about the mental health piece and the welfare and well-being, and it's not about performance psych. If it's performance psych, why is the psych not involved in the performance environment? That doesn't make sense if you really strip it back and you really think about it. Now, that might involve some communication. It might involve some general fitness levels from the sports psych, him or herself. But why not? Why not? Why can't trust me until you can't trust me? And if I make a mistake, that's fine. Have a conversation with me. Admonish me if you have to. Now I'm not going to go and talk. I'm not going to stand on the pitch and direct people tactically, but I can certainly engage in conversation around the psychosocial piece. That is. These are the things that mediate wins and losses. These are the things that mediate jobs, whether somebody keeps their job or doesn't. These are the things that mediate players' careers. Why am I not invited onto the pitch? Why?
Well, I think the biggest reason is just still the stigma that comes with the word psychologist. I think is such a heavy burden.
That comes
still
back to the
to
education piece, doesn't it?
That's correct. Okay. That's correct. I remember at the very infancy of my career in the year 2005, I just moved to Australia, and I remember there was a huge international conference in Sydney. Pure luck. I just moved to Australia, and there was the biggest international conference, and there was a very well-regarded sports psychologist who just given a keynote, and I was a bit cheeky in those days, and I sort of went up and tapped him on the shoulder. And I said, I won't mention his name, but I said, sir, can you give me one bit of advice, for someone who really wants to make it as a sports psychologist? And he turned around and he said, don't use the term psychologist. And I was like, oh, you're kidding me. You're joking. I'm just moved right across the world in order to do a program that basically allows me to use this title. And you're telling me that if I want to make it, I should use another term. So, I think it's inevitable. Just going back to your comments about the two assistant coaches that you mentioned, who were psychologists. All that really needs to happen is that I think we would agree that one of the best ways to become a head coach is for you to first be an assistant coach. So, if qualified psychologists are being given the opportunity to be assistant coaches, then the only thing missing from that anecdote, Dan, was them then taking over the head coaching role when the person who brought them in moved aside or went somewhere else. And then the only bit missing from that is for as many people to know that person is a qualified psychologist. So it might not necessarily be as extreme as not using the term head coach and using the term performance psychologist, although there's a part of me thinks that's a totally appropriate name for someone involved in helping a bunch of human beings improve, given what we know about psychosocial. But if that's too much, then it would be just a case of, such and such is our new head coach. Tom Smith is our new head coach, who is a qualified performance psychologist with 30 years experience helping people improve. That may be enough to then get a little bit of momentum going, and again, hence why they're hypotheses, because there's a part of me that's saying this because I desperately want it to happen, but I'm not sure if it will.
But and just for me, a word about players here, because I think maybe a lot of head coaches would say, oh, well, the players won't have that, rubbish. I think this is something that coaches get wrong. Very respectfully, I think players are much more open-minded. Players want to improve. They want to get better. Now, players demand competence, and there's always going to be some players who are, a little bit more closed-minded, and they might always have something to say, and that's okay. That's fine. That's fair enough. Everybody's individual differences. Again, everybody's individual, and that's fine. And you might never please some people within a squad of players, but I think firstly, I think players would be much more open to it than coaches think or believe. Secondly, I think
agreed.
I think it comes back to negotiation. I think that, well, trust me to negotiate with your players. I'd like to sit down with players, sit down with the captain, the leadership group, and say, this is what I propose happens, because as an example, we know that you have to focus your attention as you're competing and deal with distractions quickly. We know that you have to compete at a certain intensity level. We know that you have to compete with a positive intent. You have to execute your actions positively. These are the kind of things, the game winning and losing mediators, that I want to really help you with, that I want to work with you on. This is what I'm proposing. What are your thoughts? Where are your pushbacks here? What would work for you? What wouldn't work for you? How can we give this a go? Again, it comes back to negotiation. We've got to be better at the art and science of negotiation when it comes to things like that. But give us a chance to do it, because I think that coaches would see a great deal of benefit if they opened their minds and allowed it to happen.
Totally agree with that. And I love what you said. Was it trust me until I stuff up? What was the words you said there?
Well, trust me until you can't trust me.
Yeah, trust me until you can't trust me. I've written that down. That's a keeper. That's a keeper.
Yeah,
that's a keeper. Trust me till you can't trust me. And what you just emphasized there is that if you remove the label and the stigma with psychologist, and you just describe to that group of players what we do, you get complete buy-in, don't you? Think about it. It's like, I can help you stay motivated when you're not particularly motivated. We can help you, perform under pressure. We can help you concentrate on the things that are most important. If you were just to describe the processes that we do on a daily or a weekly basis, you get complete buy-in. Everyone's like, yep, I want some of that. Thank you very much. Good appointment. As soon as you say, oh, by the way, he's a qualified psychologist, you start getting a little bit of concerns. But I do agree with you wholeheartedly. Those pushbacks are probably likely to come much more from administrators, owners, people maybe concerned with the image of the club. I think if you were to say to the players, we think that a qualified psychologist is going to be best placed to be your main coach, and these are the reasons, I think you're right. I think that even in 2020, I think there wouldn't be any issues there whatsoever.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's certainly an extreme point of view, or extreme approach to say this psych is going to be your main coach. I think maybe beginning at the beginning, it's this psychologist is going to be on the pitch with us. Yeah. These are the reasons why. And again, then we fall into that negotiation. But across all of this conversation, I want to emphasise, and I'm sure you would as well, that nobody's saying, "Hey, coaches, you have this opinion and it's the wrong opinion," or "This is a terrible opinion." This opinion is or the approaches we've got right now are limited because we as psychologists, in my opinion, sports psychologists, haven't been good enough to get our message across, to help you understand what we can do. I think we need to be better at that. I think that we need to be a little bit bolder with our messages at times, and a bit braver. And we're going to get lots of pushback, and that's okay. And the last thing to say on this, in 2050, there will be some sports psychs who won't, performance psychs, if we're going to call them performance psychologists, who won't want to go on the pitch, who won't want to get their boots muddy, essentially. That's okay, but what I would say there is possibly, my hope is that actually that's where coaches will say, well, do we want that person? Do we want that psychologist? Because actually we want to have the performance psych who's willing to get out there. Now, we're going to be in our early 70s then, so maybe I shouldn't be saying this, because hopefully we'll be fit 70-year-olds who can still get out there. But so hopefully I won't be putting us. We won't be putting ourselves at a disadvantage. But look, I'm conscious of time, and I'd like to get on to. I think this is a great conversation. Let's get on to our fifth and final hypothesis.
Yeah, so I suppose, and as a natural conclusion to all of the other four, what I've written down here, Dan, is much greater unity and collaboration within the profession. And I literally have written down proper international trade union for performance psychology. So, if we're talking about what, one of the things you mentioned previously about S&C, for example, and having a lot more clarity, one of the things we haven't done yet is had a look at some of the other professions in sport and said, what have you done to clarify your position? I don't think we've done that yet. I don't think we've looked at some of the success stories. So one of the most obvious things to do would be to form some kind of international trade union for performance psychology. So you start with the correct label, as we mentioned earlier. Let's try not to confuse people unnecessarily because we picked the wrong term. And then what we do is we look at other international trade unions, other professions that have worked very well. Even if some of the people are in Australia, some of them are in the UK, some of them are in the USA, and it's a classic case of, the sum of the parts make up much more than the individuals involved. And I'll be honest, and maybe I can sort of segue into just a massive, thank you to you and a wrap for putting together the Sports Psych show, but over here in Australia, there's a part of me, I'll be honest, that sort of started to lose a little bit of hope in terms of whether or not the profession was actually going in the right direction. Here in Australia, we used to have 4 master's programs. We have 1 now. It would be very easy if you were stuck in Australia only to think that sports psychology is going backwards and hanging by a thread. I think that would be an appropriate way for me to describe it. And it was only really when I stumbled across your podcast and started listening to some of the high quality banter, I call it, that I was reinvigorated for the first time in many, many years that there are some incredibly smart, passionate and skillful people who happen to have the same professional title as me. The only thing is, some of them are in the US. Your conversations with Scott Goldman were just mind-blowing. Just like, are you kidding me? Didn't even knew he existed. I had no idea he existed. The one with Chris Shambrook as well, was just unbelievable. Rowing stupid, just immediately sort of gave me something that I could start using with my clients and my team. So I think the individual superstars, if we can call them that, exist. They just they just don't operate as a team. That's the only thing that is potentially missing. So my final hypothesis, and maybe this is partially a prediction, and maybe it's partially a call, of expressions of interest, would be a international group of performance psychologists who collaborate well together for the advancement of the profession. And all of the previous things that we've discussed during the interview would all be very common, regular discussion points for that particular group. Your thoughts on that one?
Well, at the moment, my mind is envisioning a whole bunch of sports psychologists on the picket line, with banners and placards saying "Rights for sports psychs." So I've got that in my mind. No, I love it. I think it's an interesting landscape. I think every country has its different landscape. I think it's different scene in terms of sports psych. I mean, it's fascinating listening to you in terms of what's happening in Australia. I can't believe there's only one master's program. That just amazes me, because certainly here in the UK, I honestly believe that our sports science and sports psychology is what it is today, which is extraordinarily strong. Because of Australia, because Australia beat us at everything in the 80s and through the 90s, and then we had to do something, and for various reasons, investment went through, and the English Institute of Sport emerged, and various things, and now we have very, very strong academic departments, research, very strong in terms of practitioners. There is, certainly at the English Institute of Sport, a lot of psychs who work together. So there is that sense of collaboration there. So I think it does exist. But I think every country has its challenges. I mean, I look over as a Brit to the States, and I grew up on a diet of American psychology in many respects. And yet I have interesting conversations with people over there who are there's a lot of divided opinion as to the landscape over there when it comes to sports psych. There's a lot of unregulated stuff, and at the same time there's a lot of great stuff that goes on. So I would love to see more global unity. I think global unity is enormously challenging. But hopefully things like the Sports Psych show can help. That would be awesome if people feel that it does. So yeah, I 2050, the year of collaboration, perhaps. I think hopefully the year of greater clarity, the year of greater cohesion between coaches and psychs. I think those are the three. They just happen to be 3 C's, but maybe the 3 C's I take out of this hypothesis is clarity, collaboration, and cohesion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, although the international collaboration might be regarded as the biggest challenge, and I can see that, let's just think about what you've managed to achieve in the Sports Psych show. I'm sitting, halfway between Sydney and Canberra. You're in London. Through the wonders of modern technology, it's like, we're sitting across from one another. So I think the advantage about the international approach is that what we can do is we can go, okay, what have you done in your country, Sweden? What have you guys done? And what can we learn from that? And I think ultimately, Dan, that will trump the difficulties that exist between borders. And those difficulties are really things that we could potentially just decide are not something that are going to interfere with what we are potentially trying to work on. So from my point of view, my enthusiasm for something international would be much greater than something only based in Australia, because I believe, listening to so many of the interviews that you've had on the Sports Psych show, that there's a really nice flavor of different experiences from different countries, and we could really learn a lot from what have you guys done versus us. And so for me, it would have to be international.
Interesting. Great stuff. And before we round things off, you mentioned that word technology. I mean, we hadn't really talked about technology, which could be fruitful on another conversation in the future on the Sports Psych Show, but technology, I'm sure, will play a massive role in sports psychology delivery in 2050. But Gareth, what a rich conversation. I really, really enjoyed that, mate. Thank you so much for coming on. I know the Sports Psych Show audience will have absolutely loved that. How can they get in contact? What social media platforms do you have that they can contact you on, and an email if you choose to be contacted in that way?
Yeah, sure. So probably the best thing is just to blurt out my email address. So I've got a long one and a short one. I'm going to give you the short one because it's a lot easier. So it's my first name, Gareth, at metuf, metuf.com. That's metuf.com. You can remember it. The M stands for motivation. The E stands for emotions. The T stands for thoughts. The U stands for unity. And the F stands for focus.com. That's a little project I'm working on that hopefully I'll be able to share with you and your listeners later on when it's a little bit more established. So by all means, email me. I'm also on LinkedIn. Condor Performance is on Twitter, and we're on Facebook as well. So if you punch it into Google, Condor Performance, Condor like the big bird from South America, performance as in performance, then you should be able to track me down. But by all means, email me directly, and let's continue the conversation.
Brilliant. Gareth, awesome. Thank you so much for your time, mate. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
And you too, Dan, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, mate. I really enjoyed that podcast, everyone. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.